November 22nd, 1963, for many Americans, it is not just a date. It is a memory. You remember where you were, who told you, the way the air seemed to change. In Dallas, the sun was bright that afternoon. The motorcade moved slowly through downtown streets. People waved. Children stood on curbs. The president smiled. Then the shots rang out. 3 sharp cracks that fractured more than a peaceful afternoon. They fractured a sense of safety and perhaps something deeper. Within hours, a suspect was in custody, Lee Harvey Oswald. Within days, he too would be dead. And within a year, the Warren Commission delivered its conclusion. Oswald acted alone. For some, that was enough. For others, questions lingered. But here is something less discussed. In the decades that followed, thousands upon thousands of government documents connected to the assassination were kept sealed, locked away in archives, redacted, withheld from public view. Some were classified for reasons of national security. Others were postponed repeatedly, year after year. In 1992, nearly 30 years after the assassination, Congress passed a law requiring that nearly all assassination-related records be made public. The expectation was simple, full transparency. Yet even then, releases were delayed. Pages were blacked out. Deadlines were extended. And so a quiet question began to surface. If the case was settled in 1964, why were so many files still secret decades later? What did they contain? Were they hiding evidence of a larger plot? Or were they concealing something less dramatic, but perhaps just as troubling? The newly released records do not overturn history. They do not deliver a cinematic revelation. Instead, they reveal something more subtle. Internal memos, surveillance reports, cables between intelligence agencies, warnings that went unheeded, rivalries kept quiet. They reveal institutions under pressure, men guarding reputations, agencies protecting methods, and sometimes protecting themselves. This documentary is not about rewriting history. It is about examining the pages that were once hidden. The documents the public was not meant to see, at least not right away, because sometimes the most enduring mysteries are not found in what we are told. They are found in what we are not. Asterisk, asterisk. More than 60 years later, the shots still echo. And so do the questions. Asterisk, asterisk. November 22nd, 1963 began as a hopeful day. President John F. Kennedy had come to Texas on a political trip, part diplomacy, part reassurance. The 1964 election was less than a year away. There were divisions within the Democratic Party in Texas, and the president's visit was meant to unify, to strengthen ties. The morning had gone well. In Fort Worth, he had addressed a breakfast crowd. In Dallas, the motorcade route wound through downtown streets so the public could see him up close. The mood was warm. Applause followed the limousine as it passed. At approximately 12:30 p.m., the motorcade turned into Dealey Plaza. The presidential limousine slowed. And then 3 shots rang out. Panic rippled through the plaza. Some people froze. Others ran. Secret Service agents leapt onto the back of the car. Within minutes, the motorcade sped toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. Inside that hospital, doctors worked desperately. But at 1 p.m., President Kennedy was pronounced dead. America would never be the same. Within hours, Dallas police arrested a suspect, a 24-year-old former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald had been employed at the Texas School Book Depository, a building overlooking the motorcade route. Witnesses reported shots fired from an upper-floor window. A rifle was recovered. Ballistics testing would later connect that weapon to the bullets. Oswald was taken into custody. When asked if he had shot the president, he replied simply, "I'm just a patsy." Those words would echo for decades. 2 days later, on live television, as Oswald was being transferred from city jail to county jail, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby stepped forward from a crowd of reporters. He fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen. Suspect in the assassination of the president was dead before he could stand trial. In the span of 48 hours, America had lost its president and the man accused of killing him. The country was reeling. Grief gave way to confusion. Confusion gave way to suspicion. President Lyndon B. Johnson, sworn in aboard Air Force One, faced an urgent challenge. Stabilize the nation. Rumors were already spreading. Was there a larger plot? Foreign involvement? A coordinated attack? To calm fears and establish clarity, Johnson created a special investigative body. It became known as the Warren Commission, chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren. Its task was monumental: interview witnesses, examine forensic evidence, reconstruct the timeline, determine whether Oswald had acted alone or as part of a conspiracy. For 10 months, the commission gathered testimony and reviewed thousands of pieces of evidence. In September 1964, it delivered its report. The conclusion was direct and unequivocal. Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. He fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. 1 bullet missed. 1 struck both the president and Texas Governor John Connally. The final shot struck the president fatally. No credible evidence, the report said, indicated a conspiracy, foreign or domestic, for many Americans. The Warren report offered closure. It was detailed, methodical, official, yet almost immediately, doubts began to surface. Polls taken within a few years of the assassination showed that a significant portion of the public did not believe Oswald had acted alone. The doubts were not necessarily rooted in elaborate theories. For some, it was simpler than that. Oswald had never been cross-examined in court. He had never presented a defense. His sudden death at the hands of Jack Ruby felt abrupt, almost theatrical, and Ruby himself raised questions. How had he managed to enter a secure police basement? What motivated him? The Warren Commission concluded that Ruby, too, had acted alone, driven by emotion, not by conspiracy. But for a grieving nation. The sequence of events felt unsettled. There was also the matter of timing. Within days of the assassination, senior officials had publicly emphasized the importance of assuring Americans that the killer was a lone gunman. Stability mattered. The Cold War was at its height. Tensions with the Soviet Union were real. So were fears of nuclear escalation. A narrative of foreign conspiracy could have triggered dangerous consequences. In that atmosphere, clarity became a priority. But clarity and completeness are not always the same. The Warren Commission's report filled 888 pages. 26 volumes of testimony accompanied it. And yet, as years passed, researchers and journalists began to discover inconsistencies. Witnesses whose recollections differed. Questions about bullet trajectories. Disputes over timelines. Nothing definitive. Nothing that overturned the official conclusion, but enough to keep the conversation alive. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Section 1 is this. The official story was clear, but it was delivered in a moment of national trauma. Americans wanted reassurance. They needed it. And the government provided it. Still, even as the Warren report was being finalized, documents were being classified. Internal memos, intelligence communications, surveillance reports. Some of these records would remain hidden for decades. At the time, few outside government circles knew how extensive those files were. The public saw the commission's findings, the evidence summarized, the conclusions stated plainly. But behind the scenes, agencies continued to correspond, to assess, to guard information. The assassination had not only taken a life, It had triggered a cascade of institutional decisions, some made in urgency, some made in caution, some made in secrecy. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, public trust in government would erode. Vietnam, Watergate, and other revelations reshaping national confidence. And in that climate, Americans began to revisit the assassination with renewed skepticism. What had been withheld? Why? And by whom? Section 1 leaves us at a crossroads. We have the official account. Lone gunman. A tragic convergence of opportunity and intent. A nation struck by violence, but not by conspiracy. But even as that narrative took hold, other documents were already being placed out of reach, locked in files, stamped, classified, scheduled for release decades into the eye. Future. The Warren Report may have closed the investigation, but it did not close the questions. And as we move forward, we begin to examine not only what was concluded, but what was concealed. In 1963, no unelected official in America held more quiet power than J. Edgar Hoover. He had been director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation since 1924. 8 presidents had served during his tenure. Administrations came and went. Hoover remained. He built the modern FBI. He professionalized it, expanded it, protected it. And he guarded its reputation with relentless care. When President John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Hoover understood immediately that the Bureau would be at the center of the storm. Within hours of the assassination, the FBI began assembling its findings. Agents interviewed witnesses, examined ballistics, traced Lee Harvey Oswald's background, and almost as quickly, Hoover reached a conclusion. Oswald had acted alone. In internal communications dated November 24th, just 2 days after the assassination, Hoover wrote that the public must be convinced that Oswald was the assassin and that there was no conspiracy. The phrasing was careful, but the urgency was unmistakable. The country was fragile. The Cold War loomed in the background. Any suggestion of Soviet or Cuban involvement could escalate into international crisis. The possibility of a coordinated domestic conspiracy could ignite. Panic. Stability mattered. And Hoover believed. Clarity, swift and decisive, was essential. But clarity came with risks, because the FBI already had a file on Lee Harvey Oswald. It was not extensive, but it was real. Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959. He had publicly expressed Marxist sympathies. When he returned to the United States in 1962, the Bureau opened a file to monitor him. Agents interviewed him, reviewed his activities, maintained periodic surveillance. Nothing overtly criminal emerged, but the file existed. After the assassination, a troubling fact surfaced inside the Bureau. In the weeks before November 22nd, the FBI had received information indicating Oswald had visited both the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City. The CIA was also tracking that information, yet the flow of intelligence between agencies was incomplete. Some warnings did not travel quickly. Some details were not shared at all. To Hoover, this presented a grave problem that if it became known that the FBI had monitored Oswald prior to the assassination and failed to prevent it, the Bureau's reputation could suffer enormously. In private memoranda, Hoover expressed concern not only about national security, but about the Bureau's standing. He communicated directly with the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson, too, was deeply concerned about stability. In recorded conversations, he emphasized the need to reassure the public that there was no broader plot that might entangle foreign governments behind closed doors. The two men discussed how best to manage the situation. The FBI's investigation moved quickly, Within days, agents had compiled a summary report outlining Oswald's movements, background, and likely motive, but internal. Documents many released decades later suggest something more complicated beneath the surface. There were moments of uncertainty. Questions about whether all evidence had been fully analyzed, concerns about inconsistencies in witness statements. And perhaps most significantly, a sense of urgency to establish a conclusion before speculation filled the vacuum. To understand the pressure Hoover faced, we must remember the moment in history, October 1962, just 1 year earlier. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were profound. If the American public believed that a communist government had orchestrated the assassination of the president, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Hoover's priority was to prevent escalation. Yet in doing so, the Bureau moved swiftly to affirm that Oswald acted alone. The speed of that affirmation has drawn scrutiny ever since. Some critics argue that the FBI reached its conclusion too quickly. Others suggest that Hoover feared congressional investigation more than conspiracy, that protecting the Bureau's credibility was paramount. The documents do not show evidence of a hidden mastermind, but they do show something human. They show a powerful institution under pressure, show a director who believed that certainty, public certainty, was more important than prolonged ambiguity. One internal memo from late November 1963 emphasizes the need to set the record straight before misinformation spreads. Concern was not unfounded. Rumors were already circulating. Some suggested multiple gunmen. Others pointed toward organized crime or foreign agents. In such an environment, silence could breed instability. Yet the decision to emphasize closure carried consequences of its own, because when government agencies appear too eager to conclude, public doubt can grow. As the Warren Commission began its work, the FBI provided the bulk of investigative material. The Commission relied heavily on Bureau findings, and while the Commission conducted its own interviews and reviews, the foundation of the official narrative rested largely on FBI investigation. This dynamic would later raise questions. Had the Commission been too dependent on the Bureau? Were alternative possibilities thoroughly explored? Or was the framework shaped early and never meaningfully challenged? Years later, congressional investigators would examine FBI files more closely. They would discover internal tensions, bureaucratic rivalries, and incomplete information sharing with the CIA. But in 1963 and 1964, those details remained hidden. To the public, the message was straightforward. The assassin was identified. The motive was personal and ideological. There was no conspiracy. Hoover maintained that position firmly until his death in 1972. Never wavered. Yet, as additional documents were declassified decades later, a more nuanced picture emerged. The FBI had monitored Oswald. It had received warnings. It had navigated internal uncertainties. It had worked urgently to reassure a shaken nation. The question is not whether Hoover orchestrated a cover-up of a grand conspiracy. The documents do not demonstrate that. The question is subtler. Did the Bureau prioritize institutional protection alongside national stability? Did the desire for public calm shape the speed and perhaps the scope of its conclusions? History rarely reveals villains in dark rooms. More often, it reveals men operating within fear, urgency, and imperfect information. As we move deeper into the files, we begin to see that the story is not simply about who fired the shots. It is about how institutions responded, and whether, in their effort to preserve confidence, they unintentionally planted the seeds of lasting doubt. Because if the FBI had known more about Oswald than it publicly admitted at first. What else might have been known and never fully explained? Before Dallas, before Dealey Plaza, before history fixed his name in the American memory, Lee Harvey Oswald was a restless, young man searching for direction. He was born in New Orleans in 1939. His father died before he was born. His childhood was unsettled, frequent moves, strained family life, periods of isolation. At 17, Oswald enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. In the Marines, he trained as a radar operator. He qualified as a marksman with a rifle, not extraordinary, but competent. Fellow Marines later described him as intelligent, withdrawn, sometimes argumentative. He developed a fascination with Marxism. He studied Russian. He read political tracts. He spoke openly about his dissatisfaction with American capitalism. In 1959, at the age of 19, Oswald did something that stunned those around him. He defected to the Soviet Union. After receiving a hardship discharge from the Marines, Oswald traveled to Europe and made his way to Moscow. He announced his intention to renounce his American citizenship. The Soviets were cautious. A former U.S. Marine showing up voluntarily raised suspicion. At first, they declined his request for citizenship. Oswald attempted suicide in his hotel room. Whether it was a genuine act of despair or a dramatic gesture, it had an effect. He was allowed to remain. For nearly 3 years, Oswald lived in the Soviet Union, primarily in Minsk. He worked in a radio factory. He was provided an apartment. He met and married a young Russian woman, Marina. To outside observers, his life appeared ordinary, but American intelligence took note. Both the FBI and the CIA opened files. During the Cold War, a Marine defector was not simply a curiosity. He was a potential intelligence asset or liability. Yet here is where the record becomes complicated. The CIA monitored Oswald's defection. The FBI tracked his status. But neither agency appeared to view him as a major threat. He was not high-ranking. He had not possessed top-secret information. He was, in many ways, an anomaly more ideological than strategic. In 1962, Oswald surprised observers again. He asked to return to the United States. Remarkably, the U.S. government allowed it. Oswald and his wife were permitted to come back. He regained his American passport. He settled first in Texas, then in New Orleans. The FBI reopened contact. Agents interviewed him upon his return. They assessed whether he had shared sensitive information while in the Soviet Union. Their conclusion at the time: he had not. But the file remained open. As the months passed, Oswald's behavior grew increasingly erratic. In New Orleans, he began distributing pro-Castro leaflets supporting the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He was arrested briefly after a street scuffle with anti-Castro activists. Local newspapers ran small stories about the confrontation. To the FBI, this activity was noted, but still not considered urgent. Then came September 1963. Oswald traveled to Mexico City, and this is where the story deepens. Mexico City was not merely a travel destination. It was a crossroads of Cold War intrigue. The CIA maintained extensive surveillance operations there. Soviet and Cuban diplomatic facilities were heavily monitored. According to later released intelligence cables, Oswald visited both the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy during his trip. He reportedly sought visas, perhaps to travel onward to Cuba, possibly back to the Soviet Union. CIA intercepts captured phone calls made by a man identified as Oswald to Soviet officials. The details were murky. Transcripts were partial. Surveillance photographs did not always clearly match his appearance. Some recordings were reportedly destroyed before the assassination. Following standard procedures. At the time, The information remained within intelligence channels. The FBI in Dallas was not immediately informed of the full scope of Oswald's Mexico City activity. Gap would become significant later, when President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. The intelligence community suddenly re-examined everything it knew about Oswald. His defection. His Marxist sympathies. His contacts in Mexico City. The pieces seemed alarming when viewed together. But hindsight sharpens what once appeared routine. Before the assassination, Oswald had been one file among thousands. Defector who returned. An agitator handing out leaflets. A young man searching for significance. The newly released files decades later reveal something important. There was no clear, coordinated portrait of Oswald shared across agencies before November 22nd. The CIA had pieces. FBI had pieces. Military intelligence had fragments. But those fragments were not assembled into a coherent warning. The Cold War produced vast amounts of surveillance. Thousands of names flowed through intelligence cables. Not every name could be elevated. Oswald was monitored, but not prioritized. After the assassination, internal communications show a rush to reconstruct his timeline. Where had he gone? Who had he met? What had he said in Mexico City? The confusion was palpable. Some CIA officers believed Oswald had spoken with a KGB officer associated with assassinations. Others questioned whether the intercepts were reliable. Descriptions of the man seen at the embassy did not always match Oswald's physical characteristics precisely. Was it misidentification? Poor surveillance quality? Or something more troubling? The files do not offer definitive answers. They reveal debate. They reveal uncertainty. They reveal how intelligence agencies grappled with incomplete information. One internal cable suggests concern that earlier reporting on Oswald had not been forwarded quickly enough to other offices. Another memo reflects anxiety about how much should be disclosed to the Warren Commission. This is not the portrait of a neatly coordinated cover up. It is the portrait of bureaucracy. Of compartmentalization, of agencies protecting sources and methods even amid national crisis. As we look at Oswald before Dallas, a central truth emerges. He was known to the government, but not fully understood. He had been observed, but not elevated to the level of urgent threat. He moved through the machinery of Cold War surveillance without triggering decisive alarm. And that reality poses a quiet, unsettling question. If the intelligence community had connected the dots sooner, would history have unfolded differently? We cannot know. What the files show is that Oswald's path to Dealey Plaza was not invisible, but it was fragmented. And in the weeks before November 22nd, those fragments remained scattered across desks and departments. As the narrative advances, we step deeper into one of the most puzzling episodes of Oswald's pre-assassination life, his time in Mexico City. Because in those embassy corridors, under the shadow of Cold War rivalry, something occurred that intelligence officials would struggle to explain for decades. And even now, the echoes of that trip continue to raise questions. In late September of 1963, roughly 2 months before the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald boarded a bus and traveled south. His destination was Mexico City. At the time, Mexico City was more than a cultural capital. It was a Cold War crossroads. American intelligence agencies monitored the city closely. The Soviet embassy and the Cuban consulate were under active surveillance. Telephone lines were tapped. Visitors were photographed. Intercepts were transcribed. The CIA maintained a significant presence there, and into this environment walked Lee Harvey Oswald. According to official records, Oswald visited the Cuban consulate on September 27, 1963. He inquired about obtaining a visa, apparently hoping to travel to Cuba, and then onward to the Soviet Union. He was told that the process would require authorization from Moscow. Frustrated, he then visited the Soviet embassy. What happened inside those buildings would later become one of the most scrutinized episodes in the entire assassination story. CIA intercepts recorded phone calls made by a man identified as Oswald to the Soviet embassy. In one call, the speaker reportedly referred to prior contact with a Soviet official. Transcripts were prepared. Summaries were forwarded to headquarters. But here is where the mystery begins. The surveillance system in Mexico City relied on both audio intercepts and photographic monitoring. Visitors entering the embassy compounds were photographed after the assassination. When CIA officers reviewed their files, they located photographs of a man visiting the Soviet embassy during the period. Oswald was believed to be there, but the man in the photographs did not clearly resemble Oswald. Some described him as older, broader, different in build. Was it a case of mistaken identity? Were there multiple visitors using similar names? Or had surveillance simply failed to capture Oswald's image clearly? The audio intercepts added further uncertainty. CIA reported that it had recordings of phone calls made by someone identifying himself as Oswald, but by the time investigators requested the original tapes after the assassination, they had reportedly been erased, reused as part of routine practice. What remained were transcripts and summaries. Those summaries indicated that Oswald had spoken to a Soviet official named Valery Kostakov, a man later described in intelligence circles as having possible connections to KGB operations involving assassinations. That detail alone raised alarm, but context matters. During the Cold War, intelligence officers often assigned ominous descriptions to foreign operatives. The degree of certainty behind such labels was not always clear. Still, when President Kennedy was killed and Oswald was identified as the suspect, the Mexico City trip suddenly appeared deeply significant. Had Oswald sought assistance? Had he communicated with foreign intelligence? Had there been coordination? Or had he simply been an agitated young man attempting once again to leave the United States? The files reveal confusion within the CIA itself. Internal memoranda show disagreement about what the surveillance actually captured. One officer questioned whether the voice on the intercept truly matched Oswald's known speech patterns. Another noted discrepancies in physical description. The FBI, once informed of Oswald's Mexico City activity, attempted to reconcile these details. Agents interviewed Marina Oswald. They examined travel records. They reconstructed timelines, but they were working with secondhand summaries. The original recordings were gone. Why were the tapes erased? The CIS explanation was procedural. Surveillance tapes were routinely recycled unless deemed immediately important. In September 1963, Oswald was not considered a high-priority target. In hindsight, that routine decision became historic. Critics later argued that the destruction of those recordings deprived investigators of critical evidence. Defenders maintained that it was standard operating procedure. Nothing more. As decades passed and classified documents were released, historians gained a clearer, but still incomplete picture. There is no definitive proof in the eyes. Files that Oswald coordinated with Soviet or Cuban officials in planning the assassination. There is no transcript that reveals a plot, but there is uncertainty. And uncertainty, when paired with tragedy, can endure for generations. Another layer complicates the story. In the weeks after the assassination, the CIA prepared briefings for the Warren Commission. The commission was told about Oswald's Mexico City visit, but some internal CIA communications suggest that not every detail of surveillance operations was fully disclosed at the time. Part of that reluctance stemmed from a desire to protect intelligence methods, publicly revealing the extent of wiretapping and photographic surveillance could compromise ongoing operations. The Cold War did not pause for domestic investigation, and so the commission worked with summaries. Decades later, when congressional investigators revisited the case in the 1970s, they examined the Mexico City episode closely. Questions resurfaced. Why were there discrepancies in the physical description of the man photographed? Why had certain cables been drafted and then revised? Why did internal CIA accounts sometimes differ in tone from the public narrative? Again, the documents do not offer a dramatic revelation. They reveal bureaucracy. Under strain. They reveal intelligence. Officers uncertain how much to disclose reveal a system that compartmentalized information so tightly that no single office saw the whole picture. The Mexico City mystery may not prove conspiracy, but it does illuminate vulnerability. It shows how intelligence systems, designed to monitor thousands of leads, can miss the one that matters most. And it shows how, after tragedy strikes, those systems struggle to explain themselves. Perhaps most striking is the sense of hindsight that permeates the files. After November 22nd, everything Oswald did appears significant. Before November 22nd, it appeared ordinary. The newly released records allow use to step back into that earlier moment. To see Oswald not as the assassin, but as one name among many, a restless man walking through embassy doors in a foreign city, unremarkable at the time, historic in retrospect. As we leave Mexico City, we carry with us a series of unanswered questions. Were surveillance failures merely procedural? Did interagency rivalries prevent information from being shared more effectively? Or was the confusion simply the byproduct of an enormous intelligence apparatus trying to manage global tension? The files do not shout. They whisper. They suggest that what happened in Mexico City was not neatly resolved. And in that ambiguity lies one of the most enduring shadows in the story of the assassination. Because when the shots rang out in Dallas, investigators were not starting from zero. They were beginning with fragments gathered in a city hundreds of miles away. Fragments that still refused to fit together perfectly. For more than a decade after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the official story remained largely unchanged. The Warren Commission had concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, but public confidence began to erode. Vietnam War deepened national division. The Pentagon Papers exposed government secrecy. Watergate revealed misconduct at the highest levels of power. By the mid-1970s, Americans were looking at their institutions differently, and Congress responded. In 1976, the United States House Select Committee on Assassinations, often called the HSCA, was formed to re-examine the murders of both President Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The atmosphere was different now. Lawmakers were less deferential. Intelligence agencies were no longer above scrutiny. The HSCA reviewed forensic evidence, acoustic recordings, intelligence files, and previously classified material. In 1979, the committee issued its conclusion. It affirmed that Oswald had fired shots from the Texas School Book Depository. It also stated that President Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. The basis for that finding rested largely on acoustic evidence suggesting the possibility of a second. Gunman. That conclusion reignited. Debate. If there had been a conspiracy, who was involved? Organized crime? Foreign governments? Elements within U.S. intelligence? The HSCA did not identify a definitive sponsor. And yet, even after this reinvestigation, thousands of documents remained sealed. Some were withheld in full. Others were released with heavy redactions, entire paragraphs blacked out. The justification was consistent: national security, protection of intelligence sources, and methods. Ongoing operations. To intelligence agencies. Secrecy was not optional, it was foundational. But to a public already wary of government transparency, continued classification felt suspicious. Why? Decades after the event, were files still being withheld? What possible national security threat could a 30-year-old memo still pose? Those questions grew louder. Then, in 1991, a Hollywood film, Oliver Stone's JFK, sparked renewed public interest. While dramatized, the film amplified calls for transparency, and Congress acted. In 1992, lawmakers passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. Law required that all assassination-related records be gathered in a single collection at the National Archives and released to the public unless specific harm to national security could be clearly demonstrated. The deadline was set. Most records were to be released within 25 years. It was a sweeping mandate. For the first time, the burden shifted. Agencies would have to justify secrecy rather than the public having to demand disclosure. Over the following years, millions of pages were processed. Many documents were released in the 1990s. Others were postponed. The complexity of the intelligence record became apparent. The files were not limited to Oswald. They included surveillance of Cuban exile groups, monitoring of organized crime figures, sensitive Cold War operations unrelated directly to the assassination but connected through individuals or circumstances. Some documents revealed embarrassing details. Plots by the CIA to assassinate foreign leaders. Close monitoring of American citizens. Internal disagreements between agencies. None of these revelations confirmed a grand conspiracy in Dallas, but they revealed something else. An intelligence community operating in secrecy, often without clear oversight, navigating a dangerous global chessboard. As the 25-year deadline approached in 2017, anticipation grew. Under the 1992 law, nearly all remaining documents were to be made public. And many were. Thousands of files were posted online. Researchers combed through them line by line, yet not everything was released in full. Some records remained partially redacted. Presidential administrations cited national security concerns, arguing that even decades-old information could still expose living sources, confidential relationships, or operational methods. Additional releases followed in 2021 and 2022, further reducing redaction. Each new wave brought headlines, but the substance was quieter. The documents revealed more detail about surveillance operations, more context about Oswald's Mexico City trip, more evidence of bureaucratic rivalry between the FBI and CIA. They also revealed internal frustration, officials uncertain how much to tell the Warren Commission, worried about exposing covert programs unrelated to the assassination itself. Picture that emerges is layered. There is no single memo declaring a cover-up. No hidden directive ordering the concealment of a conspiracy. Instead, there are patterns of caution. Patterns of institutional self-protection. Patterns of secrecy born from Cold War fear. And here lies the tension. The American public sought a clear answer to a national trauma. The intelligence community sought to protect sensitive capabilities in an ongoing global struggle. Those priorities did not always align. When documents are withheld, even for procedural reasons, doubt grows. When redactions remain decades later, suspicion lingers. Yet the files released thus far, millions of pages, have not fundamentally overturned the Warren Commission's central finding. They have complicated it. They have revealed that Oswald was monitored more closely than once understood. They have shown that agencies sometimes failed to share information efficiently. They have demonstrated that protecting institutional reputation was, at times, a consideration, but they have not delivered a definitive alternative narrative. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Because secrecy invites imagination. Because partial disclosure feels incomplete. Because even when pages are opened, some questions remain. As historians continue to study the record, one reality becomes clear. The withholding of documents was not a single decision. It was a series of decisions made over decades by different administrations under different pressures. Some decisions may have been justified, others may have been overly cautious. All contributed to a lingering sense that something remained hidden. As we move forward, we must ask, what do the newly released files truly reveal? Do they point to a hidden mastermind? Or do they reveal something quieter and perhaps more unsettling? An intelligence system vast and imperfect, human judgment under pressure, and a tragedy whose full clarity may always remain just beyond reach. When the final waves of documents began to emerge from the National Archives, many Americans expected revelation. After decades of secrecy, postponement, and redaction, the hope was simple. Now we will finally know. The file's millions of pages gathered under the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act were scanned, cataloged, and made available to the public. Researchers downloaded them in batches. Journalists read late into the night. Historians combed through cables and routing slips, and what they found was not a cinematic twist. What they found was something more subtle. The newly released records reveal a government that knew more about Lee Harvey Oswald before November 22, 1963, than had once been widely understood. They show that the CIA tracked his movements in Mexico City, that the FBI had interviewed him after his return from the Soviet Union, that cables referencing his activities moved between field offices and headquarters. But they also show fragmentation. Information compartmentalized. Agencies guarding their own sources. In one memo, a CIA officer expresses frustration that certain details had not been shared broadly. In another, an FBI official emphasizes the importance of protecting informants. The files reveal rivalry, not necessarily hostility, but bureaucratic distance. The CIA focused on foreign intelligence. The FBI guarded domestic security. Each operated within its own mandate, and sometimes those mandates overlapped imperfectly. For example, newly unredacted materials confirmed that Oswald's contact with Soviet and Cuban diplomatic facilities in Mexico City was reported within intelligence circles. Yet the urgency assigned to that information appears limited at the time. He was one name among many, one defector who had returned, one ideologically restless man. The Cold War generated thousands of surveillance leads. Not every lead could be escalated. Another theme emerges in the files: concern about embarrassment. Internal communications show that after the assassination, officials were acutely aware of how their agencies would be judged if it appeared that warning signs had been missed. If prior knowledge of Oswald had not been properly acted upon, institutional credibility could suffer. This is not proof of conspiracy, but it is evidence of human instinct. Organizations, like individuals, seek to protect their reputation. The files also shed light on covert operations underway during the early 1960s, operations unrelated directly to the assassination, but sensitive nonetheless. There were plots to destabilize foreign governments, surveillance, programs targeting suspected subversives, monitoring of Cuban exile groups, some of whom harbored anger toward President John F. Kennedy over the Bay of Pigs invasion. Some records were withheld for decades, not because they implicated a conspiracy in Dallas, but because they exposed intelligence tactics still considered sensitive. In other words, the secrecy was sometimes broader than the assassination itself. One newly revealed detail confirms that the CIA had been more deeply engaged in anti-Castro operations than publicly acknowledged in the 1960s. Yet those operations do not directly connect Oswald to a coordinated plot. They reveal atmosphere. They reveal context, reveal a world in which covert action was commonplace and secrecy was routine. The files also clarify misunderstandings. Certain long-circulated claims, such as definitive proof that Oswald was directed by foreign intelligence, find no solid grounding in the released material. There are references. There are questions. There are reports written in uncertainty, but there is no confirmed directive, no signed instruction, no smoking gun. Instead, the documents portray an intelligence system overwhelmed by volume, cables crossing desks. Field offices filing reports, analysts evaluating fragments, and then, suddenly, catastrophe. In the weeks after the assassination, internal memoranda reflect urgency. How much should be disclosed to the Warren Commission? What details about surveillance programs must remain classified? How can the investigation proceed without exposing intelligence capabilities? These were not trivial questions. The Cold War was not hypothetical. Soviet and American forces stood in nuclear opposition. To intelligence officials. Protecting sources and methods was not mere bureaucracy. It was national defense. And yet, every withheld paragraph contributed to doubt. Every blacked out line suggested something hidden. As the years passed and redactions were lifted, the hidden text often revealed routine procedural discussions. Sometimes it revealed sensitive foreign contacts. Occasionally, it exposed mistakes, but it did not reveal a hidden mastermind orchestrating the assassination. Perhaps the most revealing insight from the newly released files is this: the government did not possess a clear, coherent understanding of Oswald before November 22 ND. It possessed pieces, and after the tragedy, it struggled to reconcile those pieces. That struggle between incomplete information and public demand for certainty defined the decades that followed. Some critics argue that the absence of proof does not equal absence of conspiracy. That may be true in principle, but historical judgment rests on evidence, and the evidence released thus far does not demonstrate a coordinated domestic or foreign command directing Oswald. What it does demonstrate is institutional caution, a tendency toward secrecy, reflex to protect intelligence mechanisms, even when transparency might have restored trust. It shows that agencies feared exposure of their own vulnerabilities as much as they feared external enemies, and that fear shaped decisions. The newly released files also reveal something deeply human. Analysts debating interpretation, supervisors worried about headlines, officials navigating political pressure. These were not characters in a thriller. They were civil servants, operating under extraordinary strain. If there is disappointment in the absence of dramatic revelation. It may reflect the expectations placed upon secrecy itself. We imagine that what is hidden must be explosive. Sometimes, what is hidden is procedural. Sometimes it is embarrassing. Sometimes it is simply complicated. As we reflect on what the files actually show, we arrive at a quiet conclusion. The assassination of President Kennedy remains a tragedy. The official finding that Oswald fired the fatal shots stands supported by the bulk of physical evidence, but the newly released records expose the fragility of institutions. They reveal how secrecy, even when intended to protect national security, can erode public trust, and they remind us that history is not shaped only by events, but by how those events are explained. The files did not deliver a final, dramatic answer. They delivered context. And in that context, we see not a hidden empire of conspirators, but a government navigating fear, rivalry, and imperfection. The question that remains is not only who pulled the trigger. It is whether transparency, delayed for decades, can ever fully restore confidence once doubt has taken root. When we step back from the details, from the cables, the surveillance logs, the embassy visits, a larger question comes into view. Not simply who knew what, but why secrecy endured for so long. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy was not just a crime. It was a national trauma. In the immediate aftermath, stability became the priority. The Cold War was not an abstraction. Nuclear weapons stood ready. Intelligence operations stretched across continents. Diplomatic relationships were fragile. Within that atmosphere, leaders faced a dilemma: tell the public everything or protect certain capabilities at all costs. To officials inside agencies like the CIA and FBI, secrecy was not sinister. It was structural. Sources had to be shielded, informants protected, wiretap methods concealed, covert programs hidden from adversaries. Even decades later, some argued, revealing specific details might expose relationships or tradecraft still in use. And yet, to the American public, the equation looked different. If there was nothing to hide, why hide anything? When documents remained classified year after year, when deadlines were extended, when redactions appeared as heavy black ink across once secret pages, suspicion naturally grew. Trust, once shaken, does not easily return. The newly released files show that many withheld documents contained sensitive intelligence methods unrelated directly to the shooting in Dallas, but that distinction is difficult to communicate. To citizens, the event was singular: the murder of a president. To intelligence agencies, the event intersected with dozens of ongoing operations. And so two perspectives collided. One seeking closure, the other guarding capability. Over time, secrecy itself became part of the story. Polls consistently showed that a majority of Americans doubted the lone gunman conclusion, not necessarily because they had seen definitive contradictory evidence, but because the prolonged withholding of records suggested incompleteness. In a democracy, legitimacy depends on transparency, yet intelligence work depends on concealment. Those principles exist in tension. In the decades after 1963, that tension intensified. The 1970s brought revelations about surveillance of American citizens. Congressional hearings exposed covert operations previously unknown to the public. Faith in institutions declined. Against that backdrop, the assassination of President Kennedy became more than a historical question. It became a symbol of whether government tells the full truth. The passage of the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act in 1992 was, in many ways, an acknowledgement of that erosion of trust. Congress recognized that secrecy had lasted too long. The law was designed to restore confidence by mandating disclosure. And yet, even after the law, postponements continued. Presidents of both parties approved limited redactions at the request of intelligence agencies. Each time, officials cited national security. Each time, critics argued that 60-year-old documents could no longer pose real danger. The result was familiar. Another extension. Another layer of doubt. The newly released files, when read carefully, show no single sweeping cover up. They show institutional reflex, a habit of caution, a culture shaped by the Cold War, in which withholding information was safer than revealing it. Inside agencies, protecting reputation was also a concern. If intelligence sharing had been imperfect, if warnings about Oswald had not been elevated, public exposure could invite criticism. No institution welcomes scrutiny. And yet, scrutiny is essential to democracy. This is where the tension becomes most human. The officials who made classification decisions were not cartoon figures operating in darkness. They were administrators balancing risk to operations. Risk to sources, risk to credibility. But when protection of credibility leads to withholding information, credibility can suffer anyway. Secrecy can appear indistinguishable from concealment. As historians review the record today, one truth becomes evident. The assassination damaged not only a nation's sense of safety, but its relationship with authority. Every withheld document, even if benign in content, reinforced a perception of incompl, ete, and ess. And perception matters. In public life, trust is rarely destroyed by a single act. It erodes gradually, sometimes quietly, sometimes through caution, taken too far. For Americans who lived through November 22, 1963, the memory remains vivid. They remember the television images, the funeral procession, the silence that settled over neighborhoods. For many, the lingering secrecy felt like a second wound, not necessarily proof of conspiracy, but proof that the story was never fully transparent. As we consider institutional protection versus public trust, we are left with a broader reflection. Can a government engaged in global intelligence ever be fully transparent? Should it be? Or must some information always remain classified, even at the cost of suspicion? There is no simple answer. The newly released files move us closer to understanding the mechanics of secrecy. They show how decisions were made. They show that much of what was hidden involved methods rather than motives. They also demonstrate how long-term withholding can deepen doubt. Even today, a small number of documents remain partially redacted. Officials continue to review them. Each remaining blacked-out line carries symbolic weight. It represents unfinished disclosure. And as long as any portion remains hidden, the sense of mystery endures. Perhaps that is the final irony. The assassination itself may have been the act of a lone gunman. But the secrecy that followed transformed it into something larger, a case study in the fragile balance between national security and democratic transparency. Because in the end, the question is not only what happened in Dallas. It is what happens to trust when certainty is promised, but clarity arrives slowly, and sometimes never completely. More than 60 years have passed since President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. For those who lived through it, the memory is not distant. It is immediate. The sound of a television bulletin interrupting regular programming. The disbelief in a reporter's voice. The slow confirmation that something irreversible had happened. For younger generations, the assassination belongs to history books and documentaries. But for many Americans between the ages of 55 and 75, it remains personal. It marked the end of an era. An era of youthful leadership, of optimism, of a belief that the future, though uncertain, was filled with promise. And perhaps that is why the case continues to resonate, not only because of what happened, but because of what it symbolized. The death of a president is always profound, but this moment felt different. It occurred in broad daylight, captured on film, shared instantly with the nation. There was no time for preparation, no gradual decline, only sudden loss. The official conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone answered the question of who fired the shots, but it did not answer the deeper question that lingered in the national conscience. How could this happen? How could a young former Marine, known to authorities, able to defect and return, able to move through embassy corridors in Mexico City, stand in a sixth-floor window and change the course of history? The newly released files help us understand the mechanics. They show intelligence fragmentation, bureaucratic caution, institutional self-protection. They do not reveal a hidden architect orchestrating events from the shadows. And yet, even without a dramatic revelation, the mystery persists. Why? Because the assassination represents more than evidence and reports. It represents vulnerability. Before November 22, 1963, Americans believed that such violence happened elsewhere, to other nations, not here. After Dallas, that innocence was gone. The years that followed only deepened the sense of instability. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, urban unrest, war abroad, political scandal at home. For many, the death of President Kennedy was the beginning of a long, uneasy chapter. When trust in government falters, unanswered questions become symbolic, even when documents are released, even when evidence is examined. The feeling of incompleteness can endure. The human mind seeks patterns. We are uncomfortable with randomness, especially when the stakes are historic. The idea that a single individual could alter the course of a nation feels insufficient. We search for larger meaning. And sometimes meaning is not found in hidden plots. It is found in confronting the limits of certainty. The JFK files, released in stages over decades, remind us of something important. History is not always tidy. Institutions are not always unified. Information is not always shared seamlessly. What the files reveal most clearly is imperfection. Imperfection can be unsettling, because if tragedy results not from grand design, but from oversight, fragmentation, and human limitation, then the lesson is more sobering. It means vulnerability is woven into the fabric of complex societies. It means prevention is not always possible. It means history can pivot on moments no one fully anticipates. As we look back, we also see how the assassination reshaped American culture. It altered how presidents are protected. It changed how intelligence agencies coordinate. It influenced how citizens question authority. And perhaps most enduringly, it reshaped how Americans view their own government. The passage of time has softened some emotions, but not all. Even today, surveys show that many Americans remain unconvinced by the lone gunman conclusion that skepticism may not stem from specific evidence. It may stem from experience. From living through eras in which official narratives were later revised, from witnessing moments when secrecy gave way to disclosure. The JFK case became a lens through which broader doubts were expressed. And yet, as the last pages are unsealed and the final redactions fade, we are left with a quiet realization. The mystery may never fully disappear, not because of what is hidden, but because of what cannot be reconstructed with absolute certainty. We cannot replay that afternoon in Dealey Plaza with perfect clarity. We cannot recover Erase tapes from Mexico City. We cannot step inside the mind of Oswald and understand every motive. History offers evidence, but it does not always offer closure. Perhaps that is why the story endures. It reminds us that democracy depends not only on answers, but on openness. That trust requires transparency, and that even when answers are incomplete, the pursuit of truth must continue. The image returns once more to President Kennedy smiling in the motorcade. A moment frozen in time. The files have been opened. The pages have been read. The secrets, where they existed, have largely been revealed. What remains is not a hidden mastermind. It is a lesson that certainty is fragile, that institutions are human, and that some chapters of history will always carry a quiet shadow, fade to black, echo of distant applause, and then silence.